We are going to continue with the second session. We are going to brief a little bit on the Geoeconomic spotlight, the U.S. MENA policy on fossil fuels, the context of fossil fuel in the Arabian Gulf and North Africa and East Mediterranean region. Mr. Landon Derentz, Senior Director of the Global Energy Center, Richard Morningstar Chair for Global Energy Security of the Atlantic Council. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Dr. Castaneda and Mr. Mahmoud Sharif, it's really a pleasure to be here with CSGEF to talk about these issues. You know, I think if I'm going to talk about the geoeconomic implications of U.S. Middle East policy in the framing of fossil fuel, timelines really matter here. And what I'm thinking about, you know, there's been a massive reorientation in terms of policy and the relationship in the last decade that was preceded by, you know, really over a half century of very harmonious economic policy where the U.S. is an importer principally because of its massive energy demand. And you know, that lasted from the 50s all the way through until the shale revolution in the mid 2000s, 2010s timeframe. And all of a sudden, the U.S. is now finding itself as an exporter, a net exporter of maybe about 1.5 million barrels a day. Now, on scale, the exports aren't all that material compared to, for example, the Kingdom or other OPEC producers, Middle East producers in the region. That's not the case on natural gas, where we're a massive LNG exporter, but certainly on oil, that's the case. Irrespective, that, you know, that impact on relationships between friends and allies in the region in the U.S., there's still a deep policy sense of a relationship, right? I think that people must respect the diplomatic and bilateral relationships between the U.S. and the region, and the multilateral relationship between the U.S. and the region as a whole is dynamic, right? It's about security, it's about economics, it's about you know, human rights and opportunities, and it's much more robust than just this economic trade in fossil energy. But, you know, we are now strategic competitors. And so, you know, this had probably the most dramatic impact in terms of West African countries who are exporting quite a bit of supply and light crude to the United States that's been pushed out into the market, you know. So there's some rejiggering of the overall apparatus in terms of global energy trade. And, you know, certainly that has some geopolitical interests implications, because now the biggest off-taker of the region's fuel is, unsurprisingly, China, which has a huge and insatiable demand and appetite in the aggregate. Maybe that's a little bit in question right now. But that's the reorientation that we're dealing with. But that's a history. And so I want to take this and look towards the future. And I think Reed did a really pleasant job of articulating, you know, we're short energy now, and I think we'll be short energy for the future. A lot of times the discussion turns to the needs for investment in net zero technologies, renewable energies, you know, and that's $5.6 trillion a year for the next several decades. I mean, it's a massive sum, but it also overlooks the fact that even those predicting a relatively expedited transition to a net zero future, think like Bloomberg New Energy Finance, they still see tens of trillions of dollars in the coming decades in fossil energy as well. And so when you aggregate this mix, this cocktail of some things that Mr. Blakeward referred to, you know, the COVID-19 recovery, implications on inflation, the war in Ukraine, I think, you know, those factors, when you couple those also with the uncertainty of the energy transition and ESG investor pressures, create this kind of space where people don't know how much to invest. They know that we need the energy, but there's headwinds. And so there's a little bit of angst in terms of actually making that move forward. I think the good news in the near midterm is when it comes to the geoeconomic competitiveness of fossil energy, there's a little bit of room for everybody. There's room for all supply. The bigger concern is probably underinvestment that feeds dramatic volatility in an already cyclical market, right? And so that concern would then be, you know, where we don't have enough supply and we can't materialize that quickly, because these investment decisions, which ultimately are multi-decade investment decisions, take time to actually develop and bring to bear to the market. So there's a possibility where if we don't invest enough presently, that we have a supply gap in the future and the prices really move up in such a dramatic and volatile way that it does lead to demand destruction, and something that I think from a producer perspective is perhaps not the most enticing outlook. But where I really wanted to spend a little bit of extra time here, and I think it was alluded to previously, is the long-term implications. Because, oil and gas, led by hard-to-abate sectors, will still be in the energy mix. The question is by how much, right? So if you're in the IEA, an International Energy Agency out of Paris, and you're saying net zero 2050, in this scenario, there will be 24 million barrels a day of oil in the market. You turn to OPEC, and their advanced technology scenario still sees 90 million barrels a day by about 2040, 2045. The point being, there's vacillating scale in terms of which oil and gas is a part of the market. But irrespective, it's going to be there. And so, I think when we look at the geoeconomic competitiveness between the United States and the Middle East, or the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, for right now, I think we can keep producing. We can anticipate a competitive environment for investment into fossil energy and still servicing the global energy market. But when we look out, into the long term and the next generation's supply, will the kingdom still want to be a 11 million barrel per day producer, 7.5, 8 million barrel a day exporter to a market that's only 24 million barrels? If the net zero futures the IEA predicates really becomes real, are they willing to take on the scale of 50% risk, whereas they're 10 to 15% of global supply today, depending on the numbers? And I think that has implications. When you look at Qatar, Reed mentioned this idea of scaling up and massing up LNG exports, but they've been highly deliberate to only take up a reasonable amount of market share as not to become an inhibitor to kind of that stasis and the balance between the economies, right? I think when people all of a sudden are overly of scale in a certain market, that's when you start to get the antibodies, when there's a negative reaction to those policies. So everybody, I think, globally has a respect that if Qatar wants to develop the North Field and have more LNG, it's probably economic. Same thing with a lot of the barrels coming out of Saudi Arabia, right? Or the region in general, in the UAE. These are low-cost barrels. The next generation of competitiveness, though, I think was spot on when Reed said it's going to be the least cost, least carbon-intensive barrels. And that's where I want to say, if I'm thinking about geoeconomic tension and debate between the West and the region, it really comes down to this concept of, how do we address the long-term climate action goals and the net zero goals, which, by the way, the region's adopted. UAE 2050 net zero, Saudi Arabia 2060 net zero. Not everybody in the region has, but it's a pretty well-known fact that this is a general goal of those in the region, much less the rest of the Western world. And so I think, for us, it really comes down to scope 1 and scope 2. Those are prerequisites. Those are issues that must be addressed irrespective to be able to be a mainstay in this market. And I think that if you want to avoid the tensions that are on the horizon, it really comes down to that. From there, when we're talking about longevity and scale required to keep this as a central part of our global economy, I think we're going to have to eventually grapple with scope 3 emissions as well. Massive investments required in carbon management and CCUS technology. It's an area where, thankfully, the United States and the Middle East have a competitive advantage shared. So I think that's why you've seen facilities and forums like the Net Zero Producer Forum, where you have 6 countries, the United States, Canada, Norway, representing the West, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar in the Middle East, coming together and saying, actually, we do have a shared economic interest and finding net zero pathways that are conducive for producer economies. So I think that there's ways to not make this adversarial, but to make this really harmonious. But it's most certainly going to really hinge on the sincerity of action for those low carbon barrels and the overall carbon management strategy of these economies. Thanks.